Minister, thank you firstly for making yourself available to speak to us on the free trade agreement, and we appreciate the time that you've set aside for this purpose. Now, the African Continental Free Trade Agreement represents an important breakthrough in promoting inter-African trade in the years ahead. And you will know that UNCTAD, for example, has said that if we can fully implement this trade pact over the years, that the GDP of most African countries could eventually rise by 1 to even 3%. The World Bank has seen it prospectively as a means of eventually raising 30 million people out of poverty. And we know, of course, that as we look at a snapshot picture now, that Africa only accounts for about 2% of global trade. So I thought we might start by asking you again, what is our vision here for South Africa and the continent? Just remind us again of what are our objectives and our goals with this agreement.
Well, thank you very much, Prof. Parsons. Let me start by sharing some numbers. Africa has 17% of the world's population, less than 3% of world trade and world GDP, less than 2% of world manufacturing output, and less than 1% of global steel production and global auto production. And therein lies both a challenge and enormous opportunity. The challenge is that Africa hasn't industrialized anything equivalent to its potential. And the opportunity is if we can find the key elements that can drive the industrialization of the continent, it can unlock enormous value, GDP growth, employment opportunities, greater innovation in African economies. And so that's really the prize that we're seeking to do. Now, there are many constraints to African industrialization, but I would identify 3 key ones. The first is let's call it the regulatory regime that applies between African countries. We have 55 countries on the continent, and we're beginning to be the size of an India, and we're getting close to the size of a China. But unlike India or China, these are 55 separately governed polities, and in many instances with significant different legal regimes and impediments to trading with each other. So we've got to deal with that. The second one is infrastructure. Infrastructure is a key driver in trade and in the growth of economies, from energy to transport logistics, to the new digital infrastructure that societies rely on. And what we have is not well shared, and where we have them, they're geared largely to the export of raw materials. Now, Africa is a big supplier of the world's factories, but we can be the source of the world's factories. We can be this big industrial giant. And that requires that our networks, our transport routes, our logistics systems need to connect our economies better. Instead of the rail lines moving from a mining pit to the nearest port, that will of course always be part of the reality, but they can begin to connect those pits with industrial areas on the continent. When we can unlock the opportunity of renewable energy, including hydro energy on the Inga River, and of course, very importantly, wind and solar energy across the continent, and the big promise of green hydrogen a little bit down the line, that can also contribute greatly. So infrastructure is the second area. But the third area, and it's what we've seen in China, we've seen it in the European Union, in the United States and elsewhere, is an industrial policy that encourages and incentivizes the private sector to invest heavily in manufacturing activities on the continent. That's critical, that those 3, your regulatory regimes, the presence of infrastructure, and a conducive environment for businesses to invest in the manufacture of goods and of course the production of services. the African Continental Free Trade Area deals with parts of two of these. On the one hand, it seeks to remove progressively over a period of time the trade barriers between African countries. And it then goes a little bit further in seeking to develop some common norms in services markets, a common approach to the protection of investment and protection of intellectual property rights, dealing with issues of competition. It's not a single market that we're creating as yet in the way that the European Union is. It's a free trade agreement. And the intention is to have a greater level of convergence in the domestic regulatory regimes that enable the movement of goods and a greater cross-border market for services. That's really the heart of what the African Continental Free Trade Area is about.
Minister, I'm just thinking, with that ambitious agenda that you've outlined, and I think everyone understands this is a long-term process, and we'll see how the advantages unfold over time. I'm wondering, given that agenda, a necessary but a very wide-ranging agenda, we've started with this agreement it's being implemented since the 1st of January of this year. And I thought it'd be useful, against the background of what you've outlined now, where are we now after nearly a year? What are the broad timelines in the short term? And then looking further ahead, Minister, what do you think, what in your mind is where we should be if you and I will talk after the first 10-year implementation period? In other words, where do you think, given this agenda, we hope to be if all goes well within the next couple of years?
I'd like to preface my comments with the observation that Europe took many decades to establish the institutional machinery, the practices, and the governance support for the European Union and for their single market. We're trying to do something not quite as ambitious, but very ambitious, as you indicate, in a significantly shorter period of time. And it's not a surplus of ambition. It is the fact that in a rapidly changing world, the sources of growth for African countries will need to come from greater integration of our economies. So if I start with where we are, the time frames. In December last year, the heads of state across the continent met virtually. It was chaired by President Ramaphosa. And they essentially okayed and authorized the legal instruments that enables trade to take place. But building on those legal instruments, there were one or two key things that were still outstanding, of which the most important was finalizing rules of origin. Because you can have a legal regime that enables trade, but you need to know what qualifies as a product that would be given preference under the Continental Free Trade Area. So we've been working all of 2021 on getting those rules of origin increase, having a bigger number of products. And as you can appreciate, there are thousands of tariff lines, and each tariff line needs to have its unique rule of origin. You can't have a one size fits all. In some cases, a rule of origin would enable a product to trade at preferential rates when it is wholly obtained on the African continent. In other instances, there would be a portion of African content. It may be 60%, 70%, 50%, and that is a case-by-case consideration. We've done well. We've now got about 88% of products agreed by trade ministers. I came from Ghana about 4 weeks ago, where we reached an agreement on products like cheese and leather products, as well as fruit juices, and interestingly also on smoked snook, which of course is a fish only found in the waters of Cape Town and around Cape Town. Now, that package has to be put to heads of state. So the next assembly of the African Union takes place in February 2022, where the package will be tabled. And if agreed, in the view of the trade ministers, it constitutes a sufficient basis for the finalization of the tariff offers between individual countries or customs unions. So I've talked about the rules of origin. The second area that is required is for countries or customs unions to put up offers to say, out of the 100% of products on the tariff book, we are offering the following for purposes of preferential trade. In our agreement, it stipulates that in the first phase of the ACFTA, 90% of products should be tradable. In the second phase, 97% of products should be tradable. And in this first phase now, as soon as we have this agreed, the clock starts ticking. Every year, your tariffs get reduced. And depending on, there are some modalities that are being finalized, but it's between a 5-year and a 10-year period where tariffs are reduced to zero. So let me then go to where you and I would be talking in 10 years' time. Provided all these elements fall into place, and we're working hard to make sure that it does, we would look back 10 years from now and we would say, what a journey this has been. We would point out many challenges, difficulties that are the result of not only the compressed time within which we're seeking to get this ambitious free trade agreement in place, but also that unusually it has many, many more countries, potentially 54 countries. 54 countries have signed the agreement, 39 have ratified the agreement, and we don't have a free trade area that is so vast in scope, geographic scope. So we would point to all of that, but we would say to ourselves in 10 years' time, it is my hope that we've navigated all those challenges. We would recall with smiles moments when there were problems with the customs administration, or when one country unilaterally altered its tariff arrangements and heads of state had to get involved. We would have navigated that. But having done all of that, in 10 years' time, we ought to say to each other that we now are at zero tariff for many products that are manufactured on the African continent, and that we've seen a significant increase in intra-Africa trade. Intra-Africa trade today is of the lowest in the world. We trade, call it about 17, 18% of our tradable goods are with other, with neighbors, with other countries on the African continent. Compare that with the European Union, which is of course the most advanced of this type, and it's over 70%. Even intermediate arrangements, free trade agreements and so on elsewhere in the world would see in Asia well over 40, 45% trade with neighbors, in North America a higher percentage. So we certainly laggards when it comes to trading with each other. And it's not fundamentally about a lack of interest. It is when we produce platinum and our neighbor produce copper, there's no basis for trade. You can't trade copper with platinum. You need a manufacturing industry that would be able to say, we'll take your copper, you take our platinum, and we get economies of scale, we get specialization, we get division of labor, we get all the benefits that come in an integrated trading system. And scale is fundamental because investors look for the location of their manufacturing establishment by the size of available markets. That's a key driver in investment decisions. And when we have scale, as we hope we will be able to unlock, and scale is enormous, 1.2 billion people, a continent that is urbanizing rapidly, very young population, enormous natural resources, both agricultural and mineral, and of course, oil. All of these can combine with the entrepreneurial energy that you see. You travel on the continent and you go to a a market. You see people are deal makers. They're able to figure out how to get things done. But much of that is trapped only in informal activities. It's to bring that into the mainstream economy, to get that converted not only into traders, but also into being manufacturers. And that really is where we're at.
I think that's a wonderful case that you're making, why we need to push this agreement as rapidly as we can to have that transformation in the economic status of the continent and in the intra-African trade role. You've mentioned the issue and you've emphasized the opportunities, and I think we are very cognizant of the challenges. And you've mentioned one of the thorny issues about the certificates of origin. There are, of course, others, such as that the participating countries have to also undertake certain other economic reforms as the price of playing in the game. There's also the issue of the vested interests that have to be managed as we move ahead. And coming back to our 10-year lessons, what is your view? There are a number of institutions, structures, and mechanisms already built in to the agreement. How successful do you think they're going to be? Is there room to improve them, strengthen them, so that they can perhaps work better than they are working now in order to intensify the commitment to what we want to achieve here?
Well, that's really a thoughtful question, because institutions matter enormously in getting economic activity moving. And just to recall some of the key institutions that we have, we've set up a dedicated secretariat for the ACFTA. It's based in Accra in Ghana, and it's led actually by a young South African Secretary General, Wamkele Mene. And they're building up a professional team now that sees to the day-to-day administration. And that was important to separate it from the normal work of the African Union, to give it more of an implementation, market flavor, take it away from the more detailed bureaucracies that deal with political peace and security challenges. This is about facilitating trade. The second thing is we've got a Council of Ministers, that South Africa chairs at the moment, but that embraces all the countries that have ratified the ACFTA. We have senior trade officials, a formal structure that meets on a regular basis and is able then to do a lot of the technical work that cabinet members rely on for approval of key recommendations. Of course, in something like this, one must anticipate there would from time to time be challenges and difficulties of interpretation. So there's a dispute settlement mechanism that has been set up that would essentially work to resolve disputes, to arbitrate disputes between parties. So those are some of the formal institutions. There are also forums to get the customs administration officials together, so our head of revenue and that of many neighboring countries. I think that there is scope to further improve this, to strengthen them. They've just got off the ground, so to speak. They're all young babies getting on, taking their first steps. And some of it will be time that will give experience. Others will be to bring in strong technical expertise. This is an area where we have to be absolutely clear that we've got to get the best people for the job in each of these areas of dispute settlement, in the secretariat and elsewhere. And that will contribute enormously to making sure that we've got the platform on which this ambitious structure is being built.
Minister, I want to build on your remark about market flavor, because what I want to ask you is this. You will, I think, agree that at the end of the day, when the politicians, the bureaucrats, and the experts have done their job, the cooperation and the response of the business sector is tremendously important here to flesh out what we are wanting to achieve here over time. both on the trade side and on the investment side. We want to see trade and investment flows escalate on the continent over time. So I would like to build on that and say, what response are you expecting from the business communities to carry this agreement forward? In other words, you will recall that there was an intra-Africa trade fair recently in Durban. I wasn't there, but you might be able to say how successful that was as another building block towards raising awareness. And we know, of course, Minister, that with all these processes of change, and you will know it in other areas of policy, there are winners and losers. They have to be managed. I mean, the losers have to be managed if they're not to become obstructive or destructive. So what structures within that institutional framework, what structures exist to interact with business in a way that hopefully might minimize the conflict or get some agreement on what the trade-offs will have to be from time to time if we're to make a success of this trade and investment agenda for the continent?
I think the participation of the business community is absolutely fundamental. When you think about it, a free trade area is really establishing a playing field for business, for private firms. And so government has an important regulatory role. We obviously have to take the national position forward. But if that is not significantly shaped by the input and the views of the business community, then we're creating something that is not fit for purpose. So we have in an institution that I know you are intimately familiar with, you were very involved in the setting up of NEDLAC, which is of course the premier institution bringing together organized business with organized labor and government and a number of community voices. We regularly now, my officials regularly meet with the business community at NEDLAC, but also bilaterally to get their views. When we craft rules of origin, we do so actively working with the business community. In the Council of Ministers meeting that I chaired in Accra 4 weeks ago, we had invited the African Automobile Association, the Association of Manufacturers, to come and address the Council of Ministers and take us through what are the expectations of the auto industry with a trade agreement and on rules of origin. So there's a lot of collaboration working with the private sector, both at the level of country, but also we're trying to get the voice of business strengthened at continental level so that we have interlocutors that we can work with. Now, as all decisions in economics are about winners and losers. And so the way in which we're seeking to mitigate and address this is first by ensuring that there is time available. So the tariff reductions won't happen in 1 year. In some cases, they will happen over a 5-year period, in other cases over a 10-year period. So that allows individual firms to adjust to the new reality. Second, it's to discuss those trade-offs that no country can get everything. It's about finding balance. And here comes an important opportunity for us. And it's President Kenyatta from Kenya was in South Africa in the last few days. And he met with President Ramaphosa. And both presidents recognized that the strength of the ACFTA will be that it can foster and support complementary trade. If South Africa's objective is simply to take all of the little bit of manufacturing business that there may be in Kenya and replace it with South African made products, the value for the continent would be relatively modest. It would be a shift of goods from one producer to another producer on the continent. The bigger opportunity is to replace goods that are currently manufactured in other parts of the world. Africa imports about 7 trillion rands worth of goods. And Our objective is not to replace all of that. We're part of a global trading system. We want to be able to trade with the world. There are significant economic benefits to citizens and to economies in being part of a global trading system. But it's about finding a better balance, that we can't simply be the exporter of raw materials and the importer of consumer and capital goods. And it's squaring that equation that provides the opportunity for us, that if we are able to get a higher proportion of goods consumed on African markets, but now also made increasingly by African firms or firms located on the African continent, because I want to emphasize, we also want to encourage inward investment. We want foreign direct investment into the continent. So in looking at these trade-offs, they are in a number of cases, we're focusing on the greater opportunity that particular countries can get in certain value chains. And that, you know, economics is continuously the process of dynamic creation, and firms that don't survive step out, firms that have the ability to find opportunity in the market grows. It's managing that in such a way that the human dimension, workers, communities, small entrepreneurs are given a degree of support. But ultimately in a market, you also have to be able to build up your capacity and your strength. Markets are about competition. They are about businesses trying to do better than their competitors. And so it will be a combination of some complementarity in trade. So some countries may take in their first 90% offer only those parts of their economy that they believe they are competitive in, or alternatively, where they currently don't have a presence, and they may keep some of the other categories or sectors in the reserve of 10%. Eventually, when the agreement is in complete, we still have a residual 3% of tariff lines that countries have discretion on, where they don't need to make a binding offer in respect of tariff reductions. Accompanying that is also a fund that's been created by Afrixim Bank to enable companies, firms, sectors that are affected to get support in boosting their competitiveness.
Thank you, Minister. I want to ask you a final question, if I may, because I think we've identified, I think in a very good way today, the opportunities and the challenges that we face, and that in order to exploit the one and deal with the other, we need to develop a team effort between government and the private sector in order to make a success of our trade agenda on the continent. So in my final question, I want to lift it to another level and ask you, how do you broadly now see the way ahead for the African Continental Free Trade Agreement in a global context? I know you've hinted at it, but just to wrap this up, because it is potentially the largest free trade area in the world if we measure it by the number of the participating countries. So what is your final message on the agreement, given what we've discussed and given what we see as the opportunities and the challenges that could unfold as we move down the road of this particular trade agreement?
Raymond, I think when I reflect on the sources of growth on the continent, we have an opportunity with the free trade agreement to boost our trade, our growth and our jobs, but also to recognize the world has changed. Today, increasingly developed economies are looking for ways of hedging their supply chains. They've recognized the concentration risk of sourcing from only one part of the world. And so the free trade agreement provides an opportunity for African businesses to thrive, but also to get the kind of scale that enables us to export in a significant volume to Asia, to Europe, and to the Americas. Interestingly, if I take the South African auto industry as an example, our most significant external market today is in the European Union. So the free trade area is about Africans building the kind of markets that give us scale, but with a vision always of building globally competitive businesses that are able to stand on their own and provide the kind of goods and services for Africans, but also for people across the world. So I really believe if we can work and in a disciplined way address the implementation challenges of the free trade area, it can be a game changer for the African continent.
Minister, may I thank you very much again for the time you've made available. I think you've thrown a lot of light on aspects of the trade agreement for Africa. I think importantly, you've highlighted the opportunities and the challenges. And I think hopefully those who will be watching this interview will be better informed as to where we want to go, what we want to achieve, and what effort has to be put into wanting to make a success of what is an ambitious but necessary agenda for the continent of Africa and for South Africa. So thank you very much again for your participation in this very useful interview.
You're very welcome, and please stay safe, look after yourself, and I look forward to seeing you next time.